At 3 a.m., I stood in the darkness watching 47 industrial pumps drain Millbrook Resort's pristine lake into a brown cesspool. Each pump hummed with the sound of Justice One, for every year my family's barn had stood before the HOA president, decided it was an eyesore. The moonlight caught the churning water as it transformed from crystal clear to chocolate milk, and I couldn't help but smile at the poetry of it all. The best part? Everything I was doing was completely legal. See, when someone uses bureaucracy as a weapon against you, sometimes the only response is to let physics be your lawyer. Water doesn't care about property values or aesthetic compliance codes. It only cares about finding its level. And tonight, that level was catastrophically low for anyone who'd invested in lakefront luxury. My name is Silas Harrow, and this is how I turned a neighborhood tyrant's crown jewel into the most expensive mud puddle in Montana. But before I explain exactly how 3 generations of memories got bulldozed for a golf course view, I need you to understand something about small-town politics and the dangerous game of water rights that most people never see coming. You know, every time I share these stories of regular folks standing up to HOA bullies, the comments section lights up with your own battles. That support means everything, especially when you're facing down someone with deeper pockets and fancier lawyers. If this resonates with you, hitting that like button helps other people find these stories when they need them most. And for those asking how they can help keep these tales of justice coming, there's a thanks button below where you can buy me a coffee. Every dollar goes toward researching and sharing more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Because sometimes, the best therapy is hearing that someone else fought back and won. Now, let me take you back to the Tuesday morning when Cordelia Ashford knocked on my door with a smile that could freeze hell and a manila folder that would change everything. The morning started like any other on the ranch. I was in the barn workshop, fixing old Mrs. Wendell's irrigation pump when I heard the distinctive purr of an electric vehicle coming up my gravel drive. Through the dusty window, I watched a white Tesla navigate the potholes I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. The woman who stepped out looked like she'd been assembled in a boardroom pearl necklace, pressed blazer, and heels that had no business on ranch property. Mr. Harrow? She approached with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. I'm Cordelia Ashford, president of the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I set down my wrench and wiped my hands on an oil rag, studying her carefully. Millbrook Estates was the new development 2 miles down the road, full of McMansions and people who complained when roosters crowed. What business could their HOA president have with a ranch that had been here since 1952? Ma'am. I nodded, keeping my voice neutral. Think you might be lost. This property isn't part of any HOA. Her smile widened, and she produced a manila folder from her designer bag. Actually, Mr. Harrow, that's what I'm here to discuss. Recent municipal rezoning has expanded our jurisdiction to include previously unincorporated properties. Your ranch now falls within our governance boundaries. The paper she handed me might as well have been written in a foreign language. Legal jargon swam across the page, but one section was highlighted in aggressive yellow. Notice of violation, Aesthetic Compliance Code, 7.3.1. Below that, in bold letters that seemed to pulse with malice, structure removal required within 14 days. Structure removal. I felt my jaw tighten. What structure? Cordelia gestured toward my barn with manicured nails. That building is in violation of our architectural standards. It's visible from the main road and doesn't meet our community aesthetic requirements. You have 14 days to demolish it, or will be forced to take legal action. I looked at the barn my grandfather had built with his own hands. Its weathered wood, telling the story of 7 decades of Montana weather. The hand-carved beam above the door still bore his initials, TH 1952. This wasn't just a building. It was a monument to everything my family had built on this land. This barn was here before your houses were even a gleam in some developer's eye. I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. My grandfather built it the year he came back from Korea. I understand the sentimental value, Cordelia replied, though her tone suggested she understood nothing of the sort. But, progrès requiert difficult décision. We're building a premier residential community here, and certain rustic elements simply don't align with our vision. She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of the barn, each click of her camera feeling like a small betrayal. I'll need these for our files. The board meeting is Thursday evening if you'd like to contest the violation. Though I should warn you, we haven't had a successful appeal yet. As she photographed my grandfather's life work, like it was crime scene evidence, I noticed something odd. Bright orange survey stakes dotted the field between my property and the main road. Fresh ones, maybe a week old, and they formed a suspiciously straight line that seemed to include a generous portion of my land. Those stakes? I asked, trying to sound casual. New property survey? For the first time, Cordelia's smile faltered slightly. Just routine boundary verification. Nothing that concerns you. She clicked her folder shut with the finality of a judge's gavel. 14 days. Mr. Harrow, I do hope you'll make the right decision. After she left, I sat on the barn's front step and really looked at the notice. The more I read, the angrier I became. According to this document, my barn was a blighted structure that posed a negative impact on surrounding property values. They'd even included a helpful list of approved demolition contractors, all of whom probably gave the HOA a nice kickback. But it was the signature at the bottom that made me pause. Cordelia Ashford, President, Millbrook Estates HOA. Beside it, in smaller print, Ashford Development Group. Managing Partner. Finding him gone had been like finding a fish that decided it didn't need water anymore. I called him from the truck, and his voice sounded older than I remembered. Silas? That really you? It's me. Zeka. Listen, I need to ask you something about why you sold your place. The silence stretched so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he sighed, you got a visit from that HOA woman. Didn't you? The one in the white clothes? How'd you know? Because that's how it started for me too. First, it was violations. My fence was too tall. My equipment shed was the wrong color. Every week, something new. The fines started piling up. $50 here, $100 there. Then they found a clause about commercial vehicles on residential property, said my tractor was a commercial vehicle. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. They forced you out? Wore me down is more like it. Legal fees to fight them would have cost more than the land was worth. And that Ashford woman, she had this way of making it clear that things would only get worse if I didn't cooperate. 2 weeks after I sold, that development company started building some fancy resort right where my cattle used to graze. The pattern was starting to emerge, ugly and deliberate. And all of them had one thing in common. They sat above the Whitewater Aquifer, the underground river that had been flowing beneath this land since before humans walked the earth. That evening, I went through my grandfather's old papers, looking for anything that might help me understand what was really happening. In a leather folder marked Important Do Not Discard, I found it, a certificate dated April 1952, stamped with official seals and signed by a judge whose name I recognized from the courthouse portraits. Water Rights Certificate, Harrow Family Ranch. This document certifies exclusive rights to all subsurface water flow across the described 340 acres, in perpetuity, including any and all aquifer access. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood. My grandfather hadn't just bought land, he'd bought the water beneath it. Silas, do you have any idea what those water rights are worth in today's market? We're talking millions, maybe tens of millions. And if someone's building a resort that depends on that water, they'd need my permission to use it. I finished. More than that, they'd need to pay you for it. Unless, he paused, and I could hear papers shuffling. Unless they could force you to sell the land and hope you didn't know about the water rights. Most people don't even know these old certificates exist. I thought about Cordelia's survey stakes, her casual dismissal of them as routine. Nothing about this was routine. This was a calculated attack designed to separate me from my land before I realized what I was sitting on. Thaddeus, how fast can you get up here? I'll clear my schedule. This is the kind of case that makes careers. David versus Goliath. Except David's got the water and Goliath's building on sand. Over the next 3 days, my team assembled like something out of an old Western movie. Thaddeus arrived with boxes of legal precedents and a gleam in his eye that said he smelled blood in the water. Beatrice Navarro, who everyone called Birdie, came next. She'd been the city engineer before she quit to start her own consulting firm, and she knew more about water systems than anyone else in the state. "Silas, this is beautiful," she said, studying the aquifer maps spread across my kitchen table. "Your grandfather was a genius. He didn't just buy land, he bought the most crucial water junction in the county. Everything flows through here." Augustus Vale showed up last. Driving a truck loaded with industrial equipment, Gus had been installing pumps and irrigation systems for 40 years, and there wasn't a water problem in Montana he couldn't solve. "So what's the plan?" he asked, accepting a cup of coffee that was more diesel than drink. "We gonna play defense or offense?" I looked at my assembled team: a lawyer, an engineer, and a water systems specialist, and made a decision that would change everything. "Both," I said. "But first, we need to understand exactly what Cordelia's built and how vulnerable it is." Birdie pulled out her laptop and showed us satellite images of the Millbrook Resort construction. The centerpiece was an artificial lake, 50 acres of pristine water surrounded by luxury homes and a golf course. It was beautiful, ambitious, and according to Birdie's calculations, completely dependent on the aquifer flowing beneath my land. "Look at this." She pointed to a series of intake pipes visible in the construction photos. "They've drilled directly into the aquifer. No permits on file for water extraction. By the way, I checked. They're essentially stealing your water and charging people millions to live beside it." Thaddeus was taking notes furiously. "This is criminal. Federal-level water theft. But here's the interesting part, Tief. Those water rights are enforced. You could legally shut off the tap." Gus finished, grinning like a kid at Christmas. "Or better yet, redirect it." The plan that emerged over the next 48 hours was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. We would install a series of pumps across my property, all perfectly legal, since I was pumping my own water on my own land. These pumps would redirect the aquifer flow away from Cordelia's resort and back to its original prehistoric channels. 47 pumps. Birdie calculated. "One for each year your barn has stood." Poetic justice. "Really? How long would it take to install them?" I asked. Gus scratched his chin. "Working quiet. Mostly at night, maybe 4 days. 5 at the outside. But Silas, once we flip those switches, that lake is going to drain like a bathtub with no plug. And all that exposed lake bed, it's going to be mud. Expensive. Resort-killing mud." I thought about my grandfather, about the barn he'd built with hands scarred by war and hope. I thought about Zeke and the other ranchers who'd been driven off their land by a woman who saw dollar signs where we saw heritage. "Do it," I said, "but we time it perfectly. Cordelia's got her grand opening scheduled for next Saturday. Bunch of investors coming to see their lakefront paradise. Let's make sure they get a show they'll never forget." The next morning, Cordelia returned with reinforcements. 2 men in suits flanked her, carrying tablets and wearing expressions that had intimidation written all over them. One introduced himself as her husband, Richard Ashford, CEO of Ashford Development. The other was their lawyer, a sharp-faced man who looked like he ate small ranchers for breakfast. "Mr. Harrow." Richard Ashford's voice carried the authority of someone used to getting his way. "We're here to make you a generous offer. Market value for your property, plus a 20% premium. Cash deal. Close in 7 days." I leaned against my barn door, feeling the solid wood at my back. "Not interested." "You haven't heard the number," the lawyer interjected. "Don't need to. This land isn't for sale." Cordelia stepped forward, her smile gone now, replaced by something colder. "Mr. Harrow, I don't think you understand your position. The violation notice isn't a negotiation. Your barn will come down. The only question is whether you profit from this transition or lose everything fighting it." "Everything?" I met her gaze steadily. "Lady, you don't know what everything means. Everything is 3 generations of Harrows working this land. Everything is my grandfather's purple heart hanging in that barn you want to tear down. Everything is my wife's ashes scattered in the garden behind it. You think you can put a price on everything?" For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Uncertainty. Maybe. Or calculation. Then the mask slammed back down. Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. Mr. Harrow, or legal fees. The demolition order has been expedited. You now have 72 hours. I suggest you use them wisely. After they left, I stood in my barn for a long time, running my hands over the beams my grandfather had shaped, breathing in the smell of old wood and decades of honest work. On the wall hung his Purple Heart, right next to a photo of him and my grandmother on their wedding day. They'd built something here, something that mattered. And now a woman with a clipboard and a development deal thought she could erase it all. That night, we began installing the pumps. Gus worked like a man possessed, drilling and connecting with the precision of a surgeon. Bertie supervised the placement, ensuring each pump would maximize the aquifer redirection. The work was hard, dirty, and done mostly by headlamp to avoid detection. On the second night, we had a close call. A security patrol from the resort drove by, spotlights sweeping across the fields. We killed our lights and lay flat in the irrigation ditch, holding our breath as the beam passed over us. The guard slowed, seemed to consider stopping, then moved on. We waited another hour before resuming work. You know, Gus whispered, as we connected pump number 33, this might be the craziest thing I've ever done. And I once helped a guy irrigate a Christmas tree farm in the desert. By the third night, we could feel the deadline approaching like a storm. Cordelia had begun posting on social media about the blight removal scheduled for Saturday morning. She'd invited her investors to witness the transformation of the community. Turning my barn's demolition into a marketing event, I watched her videos with a mixture of rage and anticipation. She stood in front of her resort lake, talking about progress and vision, while swans glided behind her on water that didn't belong to her. Soon, those swans would be wading through mud, and her vision would be nothing but a very expensive mistake. The final pump went in at 4 a.m. on Friday. Just as the eastern sky was starting to lighten, 47 units, each capable of moving 500 gallons per minute, all connected to a single control system that Bertie had rigged to my phone. One button, and 3.5 million gallons of water per day would start flowing away from Cordelia's resort. It's beautiful, Bertie said, looking at her tablet showing the pump network, like a circulatory system, except instead of bringing life, it's going to bring justice. Thaddeus had spent the week preparing legal documents, ready to file the moment Cordelia made her move. The law is clear, he assured me. Those water rights are ironclad. You can pump your water wherever you want on your property. If it happens to drain her lake, well, that's what happens when you build on borrowed water. Friday afternoon brought one last visit from Cordelia. This time, she came alone, and something in her demeanor had changed. The corporate coldness was still there, but underneath it, I sensed desperation. Silas, she said, using my first name for the first time, I want you to understand something. This resort represents everything my husband and I have worked for. We've invested every penny, borrowed against everything we own. This has to succeed. Then maybe you should have built it on your own water. I replied. Her mask slipped completely then, and I saw the real woman underneath, not a corporate villain, but someone driven by desperation and greed to do terrible things. You don't understand. We can't stop now. The demolition is scheduled. The investors are coming. If you just... Cordelia, I interrupted. Go home. Enjoy your party tomorrow. Hope your investors like mud. She left without another word, but the look she gave me could have curdled milk. I watched her Tesla disappear down the drive and made my final preparations. Tomorrow, the barn would fall, but it wouldn't fall alone. The demolition crew arrived at 7:30 a.m. sharp, their equipment rumbling up my drive like an invading army. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the bulldozer position itself near my grandfather's barn. The operator looked uncomfortable, probably wondering why an old man was so calm about watching his property get destroyed. Cordelia arrived minutes later, dressed in another white outfit, this one clearly chosen for the cameras. She'd brought a small crowd of investors and what looked like a professional film crew. They set up quickly, positioning themselves for the perfect shot of progress, conquering the past. Good morning, everyone, Cordelia's voice carried across the yard as she addressed her audience. Today marks a historic moment for Millbrook Estates. We're removing the last eyesore that stands between our community and its full potential. This old barn might have served its purpose once, but the future requires us to let go of the past. I felt my hand move to my phone, finger hovering over the app Birdie had installed. 47 pumps waited for my signal. Sleeping giants ready to wake and redirect an entire aquifer. But not yet. First, I would let her have her moment of triumph. It would make the fall that much sweeter. The bulldozer's engine roared to life, and I watched my grandfather's life's work tremble under the assault of progress. The first blow knocked out the eastern wall, sending 70 years of memories crashing into splinters. The second took out the main support beam, the one where he'd carved his initials with my grandmother watching. By the third blow, I couldn't watch anymore. Instead, I looked past the destruction to where Cordelia stood with her investors, gesturing excitedly at the devastation, like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. She was explaining her vision for the land, talking about sightlines and property values while my heritage turned to rubble behind her. That's when I pressed the button. Deep underground, 47 pumps roared to life in perfect synchronization. The sound was subtle at first, a distant hum that you might mistake for construction equipment. But I knew what was happening, hundreds of feet below the surface. Million-year-old water patterns were shifting, finding new channels, abandoning the stolen path to Cordelia's artificial lake. The barn fell at exactly 8:47 a.m. By 8:48, the first signs of change were already visible at the resort. But that part of the story, the part where water found its own justice, would have to wait, because as I stood there watching my grandfather's barn collapse into history, I realized something important. Sometimes you have to let something die so that something else can live. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't just served cold. Sometimes, it's served at exactly the temperature of groundwater 52 degrees Fahrenheit, rushing away from where it never should have been in the first place. The investors were still applauding when the first geyser erupted in the resort parking lot, but that's a story for another time. The barn collapsed at exactly 8:47 a.m. By 8:48, the first geyser erupted through Cordelia's parking lot like nature's middle finger to progress. The water shot 30 feet into the air, sending asphalt chunks flying and investors scrambling for their luxury cars. But that was just the opening act of a symphony I'd been composing for 72 hours. From my porch, I had a perfect view of the chaos unfolding at Millbrook Resort. The geyser wasn't alone for long. Within minutes, 3 more fountains burst through the carefully manicured landscape, each one marking a point where the redirected aquifer was finding its ancient path to the surface. Cordelia's film crew, hired to document triumph, instead captured the beginning of an aquatic apocalypse. "What's happening?" I heard one investor shout over the sound of rushing water. His Italian leather shoes were already soaked as water began pooling across the parking area, flowing with purpose toward the resort's crown jewel, artificial lake that had been the centerpiece of every marketing brochure. Cordelia stood frozen, her white outfit spattered with mud from the erupting geysers. Watching her carefully orchestrated event descend into chaos, she pulled out her phone, frantically making calls while her husband ran toward the resort office, presumably to find someone who could explain why their million-dollar property was suddenly auditioning to become Montana's newest swamp. But the real show was happening at the lake itself. Birdie had calculated it would take about 6 hours for the full effect to manifest. But the early signs were already visible. The pristine water level was dropping, slowly but steadily, like someone had pulled the plug on the world's most expensive bathtub. As it receded, it revealed what Cordelia had tried to hide beneath 50 acres of borrowed beauty mud. Thick, primordial mud that had been waiting patiently under pressure for its moment to shine. By noon, the situation at Millbrook Resort had deteriorated from embarrassing to catastrophic. The lake had dropped 3 feet, exposing slimy banks that reeked of disturbed sediment and decomposing vegetation. The swans Cordelia had imported for ambiance were honking in distress, waddling through muck that clung to their pristine feathers like accusations. I decided it was time to pay a visit to Ground Zero, loading a cooler with sandwiches and cold drinks into my truck. I drove the 2 miles to the resort with the windows down, humming an old tune my grandfather used to whistle while working. The security guard at the entrance looked overwhelmed, trying to manage a stream of fleeing investors, while construction crews arrived to deal with the water situation. "Sir, the resort is closed due to an emergency," he said, moving to block my path. "Oh, I'm not here for the resort," I replied cheerfully. "Just wanted to check on some irrigation equipment on the adjacent property. You know, make sure all this water isn't affecting my systems." He waved me through, too distracted by a delivery truck that had gotten stuck in a newly formed sinkhole to question my story. I parked on a small hill overlooking the lake and unpacked my lunch, settling in for the best entertainment Montana had seen since the last rodeo. The scene below was pure chaos. Emergency pumps had been brought in to combat the flooding, but they were fighting a losing battle against millions of gallons seeking their natural level. Engineers in hard hats waded through knee-deep water, shouting measurements and calculations that all amounted to the same conclusion: they were trying to stop a river with a bucket. Cordelia appeared around 1 p.m., having changed into jeans and boots that looked fresh from the store, tags probably still attached. She was leading a group of serious-looking men in suits, gesturing wildly at the diminishing lake and the geysers that continued to erupt at random intervals across the property. Even from my elevated position, I could see the desperation in her movements, the frantic energy of someone watching their dreams dissolve into mud. That's when Thaddeus called. "Silas, you need to hear this." I just got off the phone with a contact at the State Environmental Protection Office. Turns out, someone filed a complaint about unpermitted water diversion at Millbrook Resort. They're sending an investigation team out there right now. "Someone filed a complaint?" I asked, taking a bite of my sandwich. Wonder who would do such a thing. "Yeah. Real mystery." Thaddeus chuckled. "But here's the interesting part. Once they start investigating, they're going to find that Cordelia's permits are all based on water access she doesn't actually have. The whole development could be shut down." As if on cue, official vehicles began arriving at the resort. Men and women in government windbreakers spread out across the property, taking water samples and photographs. One team headed straight for the lake, where the receding water had exposed the intake pipes Cordelia's contractors had illegally drilled into my aquifer. I watched Cordelia intercept the lead investigator, her body language shifting from demanding to pleading as she presumably tried to explain away the obvious violations. But it's hard to argue with physics. The water was leaving because it belonged to someone else, and no amount of corporate doublespeak could change that fundamental fact. By 3 p.m., news crews had arrived. The story was too good to ignore a luxury resort transformed into a mud pit during its grand opening. Investors fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, and environmental violations being uncovered in real time. I recognized a reporter from the evening news setting up for a live broadcast with the drained lake as her backdrop. "This is unprecedented," she was saying to the camera. "What was advertised as Montana's premier luxury destination has become an environmental disaster zone. We're being told that questions about water rights and proper permitting are at the center of this developing story." My phone buzzed with a text from Bertie. "Pump systems operating at peak efficiency. Aquifer has returned to pre-1970s flow patterns. Nature is healing itself." I smiled at that. Trust an engineer to make poetry out of plumbing. The sun was starting to set when Cordelia finally found me. I'd moved to a picnic table near the resort's entrance, close enough to watch the ongoing chaos, but far enough to avoid the mud. She approached slowly, like someone walking to their own execution. Gone was the corporate confidence, the HOA president armor. This was just a desperate woman watching everything crumble. "You did this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The water, the complaints, all of it. This was you." I finished my apple before responding, taking my time to wipe my hands clean. "Cordelia, I'm just a rancher who knows his water rights. If you built your dreams on water that wasn't yours, that's not my fault. That's just poor planning." She sank onto the bench across from me, and for the first time, I saw her as human rather than hazard. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We're ruined. Everything we invested, borrowed against, leverage at, it's all gone. The investors are already calling lawyers. The environmental fines alone will bankrupt us." "You know what bankruptcy feels like?" I asked quietly. It feels like watching someone bulldoze your grandfather's barn because it doesn't match their aesthetic. It feels like your neighbors being forced off land their families worked for generations. You want sympathy? Talk to Ezekiel Morse. Talk to the 5 other families you drove out. Her face crumpled, then, the last of her composure washing away like her lake. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We just wanted to build something beautiful. Something that would matter. You did build something, I said, standing to leave. You built a monument to what happens when greed dresses up as progress. Congratulations. Cordelia, your legacy is secure. The next morning brought a tsunami of legal documents, cease and desist orders, environmental compliance violations. Criminal investigation notices the paperwork piled up like snowdrifts against Cordelia's empire. The resort was officially closed pending investigation, with state agents cataloging a growing list of violations that read like a how-to manual for corporate malfeasance. Thaddeus met me at the ranch, practically glowing with professional satisfaction. Silas, this is even better than we hoped. They found forged environmental assessments, bribed inspectors, falsified water surveys. It's a prosecutor's dream. The FBI is getting involved because some of the fraud crosses state lines. He spread documents across my kitchen table, pointing to highlighted sections. But here's the beautiful part. Your water rights are so clearly established that Cordelia's entire development is legally considered to be trespassing on your water. They owe you damages for every gallon they took. I don't want their money, I said. I just want them gone. Oh, they're gone. Richard Ashford's assets have been frozen, pending investigation. Cordelia's facing potential federal charges, and the HOA, he grinned. Emergency meeting tomorrow to remove her as president and dissolve the expanded jurisdiction. Turns out, that whole annexation of county properties was illegal too. That evening, my phone rang constantly. Neighbors who'd been silent during my barn demolition suddenly wanted to talk, to apologize, to share their own stories of HOA harassment. Fletcher, Washington, who ran the hardware store, admitted Cordelia had threatened his business license when he'd refused to support her expansion plans. Martha Stonefield revealed that her son had been denied a building permit after she'd questioned the HOA's authority at a public meeting. We should have stood up to her sooner. Martha said during one call, when she came after you, we should have seen the pattern. Patterns are easier to see in hindsight. I told her, what matters is what we do now. The emergency HOA meeting took place in the community center, a building that suddenly seemed too small for the crowd that showed up. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Cordelia's chair at the board table remained empty. Her lawyer had advised her not to attend. The vote to remove her was unanimous. The vote to dissolve the expanded HOA jurisdiction was equally decisive. But the real moment came when Beatrice Bertie Navarro stood up to address the crowd. I've analyzed the water situation at the resort, she announced, her engineers' precision cutting through the emotional atmosphere. With the aquifer returned to its natural flow, that land will revert to seasonal wetlands within 6 months. The ecosystem that was disrupted by development will restore itself if we let it. What about the resort buildings? Someone asked. Concrete and rebar in a swamp. Bertie shrugged. Without constant pumping and water management, which would require Mr. Harrow's permission and water rights, those structures will be uninhabitable within a year. Nature has a way of reclaiming what belongs to her. 3 days later, a package arrived at my door with no return address. Inside was a leather journal, worn and water-stained, filled with my grandfather's handwriting. A note was attached. Found this in the barn wreckage. Thought you should have it. A friend. I spent hours reading his words, written over decades of ranch life. Most entries were mundane weather reports, cattle counts, equipment repairs. But scattered throughout were pieces of wisdom that felt prophetic. Water is patient. One entry read, it remembers its path even after men forget. The aquifer beneath this land has flowed since before memory. Anyone who tries to cage it will learn that water always wins, even if it takes time. Another entry, dated just months before his death. Worried about developers circling like vultures, showed Silas the water rights papers today. Made sure he knows what we really own here. The barn is just wood and nails, But the water, that's the real inheritance. Guard it well. I closed the journal and walked to where my barn had stood. The demolition crew had cleared the rubble, leaving only the concrete foundation my grandfather had poured. In the fading light, I could see the futura new barn rising from the old foundation, built with reclaimed wood from Cordelia's failed resort. It seemed fitting somehow. Turning their monument to greed into something useful, Augustus arrived. As I was measuring the foundation, "Heard you might be rebuilding," he said, climbing out of his truck with a set of blueprints. "Thought you might like these." Found them in county records, your grandfather's original barn plans. Every measurement, every joint, every beam. We spread the plans on the tailgate of his truck, studying them in the beam of his headlights. They were beautiful in their simplicity, designed by someone who understood that good things were built to last, not to impress. "When do we start?" Gus asked. "Tomorrow," I decided, and this time, we're adding something new. "What's that?" A plaque. Harrow barn built 1952. Rebuilt 2024. Defended forever. Word spread quickly about the barn raising. By the weekend, I had more volunteers than I could use. Fletcher brought lumber. Martha organized food for the workers. And even some of Cordelia's former supporters showed up with tools and apologies. The community that had been divided by HOA politics found common ground in raising walls and setting beams. Thaddeus stopped by on the second day of construction, bringing news that made everyone pause their hammering. Richard Ashford filed for bankruptcy this morning. Personal and corporate. The resort property is going into receivership. What happens to it? Fletcher asked. Given the environmental violations and the water rights issues, the state is considering turning it into a wildlife preserve. The wetlands, Bertie mentioned, are already forming. They found 3 endangered species of birds nesting in the mudflats where the lake used to be. I had to laugh at that. Cordelia had destroyed habitat to build her paradise, only to accidentally create better habitat when it all fell apart. Nature really did have a sense of humor. The new barn came together faster than expected. Modern tools and old-fashioned community spirit made quick work of what had taken my grandfather months to build alone. But we were careful to honor his design, even incorporating some of the original wooden beams that had survived the demolition. Each one was marked with the initials of families who'd lost land to Cordelia's Schemia monument to resistance and resilience. On the day we raised the final beam, Bertie arrived with a gift. "Thought you might appreciate this," she said, unrolling a large survey map. "It's the original aquifer study from 1951, the one your grandfather used to establish his water rights. Look at his notes. In the margins, in fading pencil, my grandfather had written, 'This water has flowed free for thousands of years. My job is not to own it, but to protect it for those who come after. Let any man who tries to steal it learn that water has its own justice.'" He knew, I said softly, he knew this day would come. Engineers recognize engineers. Bertie smiled. "Your grandfather understood systems, water systems, legal systems, community systems. He built protections into all of them." The barn was officially completed on a Thursday. Exactly 1 month after Cordelia had demolished the original, we held a small ceremony. Nothing fancy. Just neighbors gathering to mark the moment. Someone had brought a photo of my grandfather to hang beside his Purple Heart, and flowers appeared throughout the day, left by people who remembered what community used to mean. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, I got an unexpected visitor, a young woman, maybe mid-20s, wearing jeans and boots that had actually seen work. She introduced herself as Jennifer Ashford, Cordelia's daughter. "I wanted to apologize," she said, refusing my offer to come inside. "For my mother, for all of it." I tried to tell her this was wrong, but she wouldn't listen. She got so caught up in the development dream that she forgot what really mattered. "You're not responsible for your mother's choices." I told her, "Maybe not, but I need you to know that not all of us agreed with her methods. Some of us still believe in earning what we have, not taking it." She handed me an envelope. This was in her office. "I thought you should have it." Inside was a photo I'd never seen my grandfather and grandmother at what looked like a community barn raising, probably from the 1950s. They were young, smiling, surrounded by neighbors helping to build something together. On the back, someone had written, "Thomas and Mary Harroth, kind of neighbors everyone wants." "Where did she get this?" I asked. "County Historical Society. She was researching ways to prove your barn had no historical value." Jennifer shook her head. Instead, she found evidence of everything she was trying to destroy. "I think that's why she pushed so hard. She knew what your family represented, and it threatened everything she wanted to build." After Jennifer left, I sat in my new barn, surrounded by the smell of fresh sawdust and the echoes of hammers that had fallen silent. The space felt different from the original, not better or worse, just different, like a song played in a new key, familiar, but changed. My phone buzzed with a message from Thaddeus. Final update. Cordelia pled guilty to federal water theft charges. 18 months minimum security. 3 years probation. The resort property officially designated as protected wetlands. Your water rights recognized as senior claim over entire aquifer. Congratulations. Silas, you won. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a guardian who'd done his job, protected what needed protecting, and honored the trust my grandfather had placed in me. The water still flowed beneath my feet, following paths older than human memory, indifferent to our victories and defeats, but always finding its way home. The next morning, I woke early and walked to where the barn stood, silhouetted against the dawn sky. It looked right somehow, like it had always been there, would always be there. The wooden sign Gus had made hung by the door. Harrow Barn built 1952. Rebuilt 2024. Defended forever. I ran my hand over the letters, thinking about all the fights that had led to this moment. Cordelia was gone. Her resort was returning to nature. And the community had remembered what it meant to stand together. The water rights that had saved us were safely documented and filed where no HOA president could touch them. But more than that, we'd proven something important. Progress didn't mean erasing the past. Development didn't require destroying what others had built. And sometimes, the old ways patience, persistence, and knowing your water rights were the best defense against those who confused ambition with authority. As I headed back to the house, I noticed a small stream had formed near the barn, fed by the springs that were reasserting themselves across the landscape. The water ran clear and cold, following a path it had carved long before any of us had claimed ownership of the land above it. I thought about leaving a message for whoever would stand here in another 70 years, defending whatever needed defending then. But the barn itself was message enough, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, that bullies could be beaten, and that water, given time and freedom, would always find justice. The pumps that had drained Cordelia's lake had been sold to other ranchers facing their own battles, spreading the tools of resistance across the county. The story had traveled even further, inspiring others to check their own water rights, to question suspicious HOA expansions, to stand up when standing up seemed impossible. That's the thing about water, it doesn't just flow, it connects. Every stream leads to a river, every river to the sea, and every story of successful resistance flows into the next one, giving courage to those who need it most. Cordelia had thought she was fighting one old rancher with an outdated barn. She'd actually taken on an entire watershed of people who understood that some things were worth preserving. As for me, I still fix pumps in my workshop, still drink coffee on my porch each morning, still check the water levels in the wells my grandfather dug. The only difference is now I do it in a barn that's been tested by fire and emerged stronger, protected by laws older than greed and more powerful than any HOA regulation. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the mist rises from the restored wetlands where Cordelia's resort once stood, I swear I can hear my grandfather laughing. It's the sound of water returning home, of justice flowing downhill, of a man who knew that the best inheritance he could leave wasn't just land or buildings, but the wisdom to know when to stand firm and let nature take its course. The barn stands, the water flows, and somewhere in Minnesota or Michigan or Mississippi, another small town David is reading about water rights and HOA overreach, preparing for their own battle against a Goliath in a white suit. To them I say, Check your grandfather's papers. Know your rights. And remember, water always wins in the end. It just needs a little help sometimes from someone willing to install 47 pumps and wait for justice to find its level. The last time I saw Cordelia was 6 months later at the county courthouse. She was there for a probation hearing. I was filing the paperwork to establish a water rights preservation trust something to protect the aquifer long after I'm gone. We passed in the hallway, and for a moment, our eyes met. She looked smaller somehow, dressed in simple clothes, instead of her signature white suits, carrying herself like someone who'd learned hard lessons about humility. Because in the end, that's what this whole story was about. Not revenge, though it might have started there. Not even justice, though that's what we achieved. It was about remembering that the things worth fighting for are usually the things that flow beneath the surface, ancient, patient, and powerful enough to move mountains one drop at a time.